problem is how that is presented in terms of as an actor in international affairs. So that is just, that's the think piece bit. I don't know where that's quite going to go or even if it makes sense, but that's where I want to start.
Thank you very much. You've been thinking about this all.
Yeah.
I can recognize something, you're thinking vis-a-vis, some of the speakers at the conference, and the recent conversations we had, so this is very good. So the thinking is continuing around this table with some more questions and discussion, I hope. So who would like to be first in asking a question or maybe give a comment? Perhaps Marika? Is that right?
Thanks, yeah. That's a very interesting paper. Mainly I think it's interesting because I agree with your analysis.
Okay, I'm relieved.
There are, I think there are a couple of unresolved questions, in addition to what you indicated at the end. One of the unresolved questions which you mentioned, what role does the EU have if it's not a coherent actor? And it's already so incoherent. And then embracing a further model of incoherence kind of seems to be plausible. But that's not the question I want to ask. I think the US has fueled the ongoing discussion about the EU as a pivot. And I believe it's done it for its own reasons and my interpretation. And the question is, what do you think is my interpretation? Nobody knows what to do with Russia. You know? Russia is a European power. Russia is an Asian power, as we all know. Vladivostok is on the Pacific, you know? So my interpretation is that the US doesn't want to abandon the EU or the notion of the EU because it doesn't know how, it doesn't want to then open up further claims that Russia represents some kind of legitimate voice. And because the Russian problem is not going to be resolved, I think the Russian question won't be resolved. The EU problem will be resolved before the Russian question will be resolved. So what do you think? Is the US sort of just, at a time when everything's changing so quickly, it's actually quite clever to allow some things to sort of just chug along. They're quite useful for other things that are not obvious if you just look at policy. Let sleeping dogs lie, as it were, because as it happens, the US has got enough problems in sorting out Russia's intervention and interests in the Middle East. So what do you think of my view on that?
I think it's great you brought Russia in, because I find the Russian role in international affairs, I think, is more interesting and fascinating now than it was during the Cold War. I'm intrigued though. Could you just answer, just very briefly, what is the central Russia question for you? If you say there is a Russian question, what would that be?
Right.
I've asked it half an hour.
Yeah. Well, the subsidiary, the number one subsidiary question to the Russia question is Russia-China relations.
Oh, okay.
And the degree to which Russia-China competition, because there's very little that, despite agreements about Kazakhstan and the stars and so on, there's actually not, in terms of realpolitik, there isn't much love between Russia and China. Although on the cards there should be, because Russia's got enormous resources that China desperately needs, but China, whenever possible, prefers to source those from Kazakhstan or some other, or Iran for that matter, you know? So I think that is the first thing. And because there's this unresolved question between Russia and China, it then makes US uncertainty about its China relationship even stronger. My interpretation is that, you know, the American ambassador to Australia retires this week. He's been giving speeches all over the place. It's very interesting that China and the US share so much in common. We basically like each other. We need each other. None of us can be without the other. Now, a lot of that is also to do with that unresolved question of where does Russia fit in. Then there are other subsidiary parts to the Russia question, which is Russia's role in Europe, and Russia's, at every level, foreign investment, technology transfer, refugees at every level, but Russia and Middle East. Now, the other thing about the US, of course, in all of this is, which is why the current debate on Syria is so interesting, Obama gave the impression that for the first time since the Vietnam War, now the US is going to take Asia seriously. And I, for one, in my writing, have been very critical of the extent to which the US has seemingly abandoned the Asian region and kept saying to Japan, for God's sake, Japan, you take leadership, or Australia, you take leadership, so much so that John Howard actually said that we're the deputy sheriff in this part of the world. By the way, a colleague of mine who documented that in a book that was then published by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade got a phone call saying that if this book is published in the current form, quoting and documenting that statement, DFAT would shred all copies of the book. So that statement was removed from that. I'm talking about a Monash academic who told me the story. Anyway, so that Russia, there's a hierarchy of questions. At the top of that hierarchy is how it feeds directly into the US-China relationship. Then the second hierarchical level is the whole Middle East, because although Obama says, whoop, we're going over here to Indonesia, well, they're not really whooping over there, because they have a powerful policy against Iran too. And the Iranian policy is part of geostrategic positioning for the Gulf and the Middle East, which is why Syria is important. And so basically, every time the US looks at its strategic interests in some part of the world, damn it, there's Russia! And the same applies to the Antarctic, by the way, most of which we still are, the Antarctic. So, anyway, sorry, but Russia.
Great. Russia, You see, that's, John would have
the bear in the room.
I would have a different take on that, because I think there's been radically declining interest in Russia in Washington over the last decade. I think since 9/11 and how Russia suddenly became very important in terms of in the 2000s, with running the NATO operation in Afghanistan and the role of the Central Asian republics, Russia becoming increasingly reticent to cooperate, very reluctantly. Coupled to that, the development of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which for a while looked like, it's the Asian NATO, it's going to be a huge military industrial bloc, anti-Western bloc. That, I think, has largely died out. The idea of the SCO being a rival, I think, has completely faded out, precisely for the reasons you say.
I agree. The main purpose of that, insofar as I understand the research that we've done here and elsewhere, is an attempt to control cross-border terrorism.
But that was
and
the
Uyghurs.
origin.
That was the origin.
Yes.
And I think that is probably its main value.
But Putin had big plans. Putin did want, some genuine Central Asian bloc, and the Chinese have refused to play ball. So I don't quite see. I think Russia wants to be a player. It wants to be a Pacific player, and it is a very important Pacific player in terms of the Koreas. But I don't see Washington looking at China with Moscow in the background. I don't. No. I think that's Russia is an irritant. Obama's comment about Putin being a bored kid sat at the back of the class, I cannot imagine him saying that about any other world leader. I was amazed. So,
but that isn't. Yes, I was amazed too. But then, we have all along estimated Russia. We won the Cold War, and now we're losing the post-Cold War. You know, there's some real American diplomacy on Russia is...
We're all just talking about Russia. If there are any other questions?
Can I make another question?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Sure.
I think it's better if we keep focused on...
Yeah, sorry.
I'm the Consul General of Greece. I'm very interested in European issues because I was the Ernst Consul back in Brussels for 5 years before I left. And I have seen a lot of things happening in the European Union between 2006 and 2010 when I left. So I fully agree with you that there is a completely different role that the US is playing, not only in the Southeast Asian Pacific region, but also in the rest of the world vis-a-vis to the European Union world. And being a Greek, I would rather say that the US is Mars and European Union is Venus. Of course, there are a lot of problems and there are a lot of challenges for the European Union, as you have referred to the EAS. I remember the time when Mr. Solana was there before Mrs. Ashton. And there were also a lot of hiccups and discussions and how we move forward. And he was always coming forward saying, I would rather ask for forgiveness rather than permission. When he was talking about coordinating the rest of the European Union member states on issues of foreign policy. This is not an easy way to go forward when you just ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And Mrs. Ashton, certainly, she was not the brightest star in the European Union political system. So when she took over, she had a lot of things to learn. She had a very, very big role, a lot of tasks, a new role to fulfill. It was not an easy thing. The European Union members, we had a lot of discussions. There were a lot of backthoughts. If the ES should be, let's say, the best diplomats joining or sending there the second or the third class diplomats to join and keep the good ones for ourselves and for our missions. I mean, there were a lot of discussions how to share. But I remember when we were preparing as relics the CFSP report every year for the European Union, indeed, there was very, how can I say, it was not enough attention paid in the Pacific. And I remember it was the 2007 or the 2007 report, and we even missed Australia and New Zealand. And I noticed and I said, excuse me, there's something missing here. We have referred to all the other places and we have skipped Australia and New Zealand. What is this? Oh, they said, okay, we will put a paragraph. It was the kind of drafting into 27 member states. Now I'm glad, because I'm here the last 3 years and I'm following things from down under. And I'm glad to see that Australia has a very important role to play. And at the same time, for example, last year we will have the G20 in Brisbane. Australia is a non-permanent member of the Security Council. So there is an increasing role for Australia to play in the region. And there are a lot of positive, let's say soft power kind of bridges that we can build between the EU and this region in general and Australia in particular. As far as what you have referred about European Union being strong during the 2001 and this time of year when there was a lot of optimism because of the euro and the constitutional treaty and all these discussions that Europe was moving forward and we were creating the CFSP and all these options. And now that the economic crisis, in a way, has diminished the European Union role in the global policies, I was very surprised to see that during the 2001, when I was in the UN headquarters in New York, no matter how strong the EU was in, we were not able to play a more, how can I say, a more productive role during the Iraq war time, the Security Council.
Well, it's completely divided, of course.
Exactly, we were completely divided. And now that we are not so strong from the point of view of economic power, it is probably things as, for example, as the Syria example was presented. The European Union is playing a much low profile and wiser role, and this kind of role is bringing more results, and we can see now on the Syria issue that the European role is becoming more and more important. And of course we have a lot of surprises, like the British Parliament decision that was never to be expected to have taken place, and all the other Europeans that are playing more. So now it's like,
member states.
It's like, yeah, it's the member states, right? But the member states are a part of the EU.
Sure.
And the British, they were always influencing the European Union policy in a much, very decisive way, the CFSP. So now things are even changing for them.
I'm just wondering if we couldn't get Ben Weddings to ask and combine the two reflections.
Just the question. Do you think that in the near future we will see the European Union playing a more active role around its neighborhood? Like saying not only the Middle East, but North Africa, which is also a region of major concern for the European Union, as well as the Middle East and the other areas, because honestly, what you have referred to, like having the Americans being more interested in the Southeast Asia, I have been listening to this argument since 1998 when Clinton, not Miss Clinton, Mr. Clinton was there. There was a big discussion about this thing, and this thing comes again and again. It is not new. It has been reproduced for many, many decades, and the truth is the United States is mainly interested in the Middle East area, and I fully agree, because there are a lot of vital interests of energy or other security issues that are also very important for them.
True.
For the European Union too.
Giles, can I make a suggestion, because I'm conscious of time, that we get one last question and then you answer everything? Would that be okay?
That's good. Right. Well, look, if I've understood what you're saying rightly, it's when things get hard, lowering standards and expectations, and I think that's probably a good thing, right? And you mentioned this lovely phrase that if the EU was to engage with Asia, it would have to come face to face with its reduced status in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that the EU, when it was set up, was precisely to deal with Europe's reduced status in the world. So I think that it would actually, its history would equip it quite well for that role. The problem is that there's been a period of hubris in between, and that particularly around that time that we've mentioned here, and you mentioned from about 2000 to 2003, when things were going very well. But they were going very well, and the contrast that was often made was against America. This was like a better version of civilization. You think of Hubmaster's intervention in 2003, or the preamble to the Constitution, which defined Europe as a special area of human hope. These are vaulting terms, and I think what you're suggesting is kind of like an opportunity for downsizing, which may be seen in terms of a loss of status, but actually might be just what the doctor ordered. I mean, in terms of then your proposal maybe of leaving the EU to trade and having member states, that would seem to make good sense. And then it's the question, well, wouldn't countries like Britain and France have more to do in their neighbourhood, if you're saying we're talking about the North Africa and so on? Maybe so. then it just raises the steps, well, why wouldn't Australia become a kind of a proxy for Britain in the region?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, where to begin? The immediate European neighbourhood, yes, it's conceivable, but I don't see the resources. I think there is a very defensive mentality in Europe these days about, okay, what can precisely be done? You know, what's achievable? Libya was a very interesting example. And there you had, Britain, France in the lead, and a handful of other states, Belgium, the Danes, heavily involved, but no one else. And I think that basically sums up the problem. There is a complete division of interest, and I think Germany is at the centre of that. The German military, on paper, is a very large institution, and there is absolutely no willingness from the political class or the electorate to use it. There is a kind of very large social program. So if you've got the economically the most powerful state at the heart of Europe not willing to really be the motor for a broader political security agenda, I don't see it really getting off the ground. You will have the British involved in stuff and the French, but it won't add up to a European position, even in the immediate neighbourhood. So it's yeah. Conceivable, yes. Probable, no. Yeah, my point about the EU is really, if it gets hard, downsize. I guess, yeah, that's perhaps a brutal rephrasing, but I can see why you did it. It's more, for me, credibility. Credibility is the crucial issue. How long can you? It comes because it's the 20th anniversary, if you like, of the capabilities expectations gap article. That drew me back to looking at it once again, what it said about Europe in the early 90s, and that whole issue of one can go only so far with big expectations, vaulting language, as you mentioned. And I think it's one thing to have great ambitions and saying it's going to take a long time to get there and step for step, and there have been massive evolutions. I mean, the single market, Maastricht, and single country, that whole period is immense in terms of shifting the European mentality into being an international actor. I think I would date it really from the single market period. But I think that's different when you try and really act as an international actor with one voice. In trade, yes, that's quite clear. WTO. That's quite clear. But then if you move into the whole diplomatic arena, and you still have this problematic array of different opinions, voices, strategies, then I think you've got to take a hard look at what's going on. And I feel that the Asia-Pacific region is definitely the area where nations and organisations are looking at the EU. And there is much less appreciation for the EU as well, for that reason and other reasons. So this is a real test case, I think.
But why you two seem to agree that EU action on the diplomatic, foreign policy, defence side is of doubtful value, possibility, division, but that on the trade side it's much more effective. But if you actually look at the evidence on trade and foreign direct investment, especially after the global financial crisis, all I can see is more and more competition. The fact that there is an EU market with some sort of common barriers, or rather lack of barriers, but from the Indian perspective, which I mainly work on, it's barriers in the form of subsidies to French farmers. When you actually look at that trade, and especially that investment, it's just as brutal. The competition.
Within Europe?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Germany is trying to grab as much foreign investment as it can from India. Britain does quite well for historic reasons. Everyone else has to pick up the crumbs. Then there's a lot of data that at one point the British were suddenly very pro-EU because it looked as if the EU was going to negotiate a great purchase by India of jet fighters, and Britain thought, oh, we have, you know, the French and the Germans have done good in persuading the Indians that they're better at this, but if we hop onto the bandwagon, perhaps we can get a national share of this. And of course it didn't happen, and then Britain went away licking its wounds. But where's the evidence to suggest that on the trade side, the EU is a more effective actor than on the diplomatic or defence side?
Well, it will be the TTIP, you know. If that got a grip, then a single EU member state can't do that.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. If there is something big on the agenda where the whole weight of the EU market, single market, can be played with one card, then yes. WTO has been blocked for the last decade or more, so it hasn't been able to do it for precisely what you say, those state systems. Yes. But with perhaps in the transatlantic area, and I think the TTIP is really big because it could kickstart the whole idea of the transatlantic axis across a whole array of public policy fora, including WTO and beyond. So there's an awful lot at stake, I think.
So you're quite optimistic on trade and foreign investment in terms of the EU's future capacity to be a meaningful, coherent actor?
Yes, major divergences between and competition between member states accepted, but yes, on paper, yes. Yes.
On paper, hang on.
Yes.
Hang on, you said
it's also an important.
But hang on, you said on paper. But when you talk about diplomacy and defence, you don't want the paper stuff, you want the real stuff. So why suddenly, if it's trade and investment, it's paper stuff and not the real? I don't get it.
No, I only meant on paper in terms of it's still to be tested.
Oh. Okay.
If the TTIP crashes, if the Americans sign a big Trans-Pacific deal instead, and say, okay, now you've got to follow the rules we've signed with our Pacific colleagues, then it's second best, and that can happen. That could easily happen. So, I mean, that's the interesting thing about the transatlantic economic network block, whatever you want to call it. The FDI is enormous in that. The GDP is enormous. The banking assets is enormous.
Yeah. But
there is this kind of sense of it's always going to be a massive section of, or a sizable section of global economy, so it's taken for granted. And I think that, that's a danger.
Okay, is that going to be the last one? I think yes. Thank you very much, Giles.
Thank you for coming.
Continue with a glass of wine at this stage. Thank you very much for very stimulating discussion, questions. So now you have to put Russia back in.
Yeah, no, Russia's fascinating.
Yes.
we could do a book on Russia. No one's brave enough to do it.
Yeah,